Hello and welcome along to the latest episode of Edie's Susty Talk, our video interview series launched back in spring, designed to keep us feeling connected during lockdown, the next lockdown, the next lockdown and beyond. I'm really delighted to have two great speakers from the built environment sector on the call with us today, and that is Basil, the gentleman with the glasses. Basil is the managing director at FORE Partnership, which is a purpose-led property fund. And joining myself and Basil is Peter Fisher, who is the director at architectural practice Bennetts Associates. So a warm welcome to both of you. How are you both?
I'm doing all right, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, very well under the circumstances that we're in at the moment. Thank you.
Good to see you, and just refreshing to see London, even if it is just from behind my computer screen and into your offices. I think it'd be good to start off by hearing a brief overview of what your companies are doing in terms of sustainability and what your role and remit on delivery for that is, because I believe it's the first time we've had you guys on for Susty Talk. So perhaps we could start with Basil for this one.
Sure, great. Yeah, my name is Basil Demeroutis. I run a firm called FORE Partnership. We're a real estate investment fund. As you mentioned, Sarah, we're with a purpose-led business, meaning that we view our role to drive innovation in the built environment, both on the environmental sustainability and social impact side. We think that ultimately that drives higher returns for our investors and obviously has huge benefits in terms of the built environment and the wider stakeholder group that we consider near and dear, our communities and other people who use the buildings and structures that we put together. We invest in mostly office space. So about 2/3 of our current portfolio is in commercial offices, although we do have some investments in the residential space, and we're dipping our toes into other living sectors like senior living, senior housing shortly.
Got it. And Peter, it'd be great to hear a bit more about what Bennetts' targets are and how you help to deliver those as
well. Yes, hello. I suppose as architects, we've got two different types of impacts, and I think we have our own direct impacts as an organisation, and our indirect ones, I suppose, as designers of the built environment. And in a way, while we've more direct control over our own impacts, obviously our impact through those indirect, the buildings that we design, is much, much greater. I mean, I think as an organisation, we're responsible for about a ton of carbon dioxide per person per year, whereas I believe that architects specify about 500 tons of carbon dioxide or materials that emit about 500 tons per year. So obviously the designs we do significantly outweigh our organisational footprint. Nevertheless, we were, I think, the first firm of architects in the world to have approved science-based targets, and that's played a key role in our organisational trajectory towards net zero carbon, and that has also become increasingly significant in the drive towards net zero carbon, and actually putting hard numbers to that. And a lot of that is beginning to come through in data and targets that are coming through organisations such as the UK Green Building Council, and that is making its way into quite a lot of the. Similarly to Basil, the majority of our work is in the commercial office sector, some in cultural, some in higher education as well, but comparatively little in residential.
And you mentioned there about that dual approach, the approach of looking at your own house, but also looking at your collaborations and the work you do for others. And I've seen a lot of that in 2020 from businesses, particularly with the SBTi having new guidance on Scope 3 emissions and things like that. But just against the backdrop of 2020, what has collaboration across that value chain look like for you? What are you seeing your sort of end user clients asking for in terms of spec, and how are you working with suppliers to deliver that as well?
I think it's been a fascinating year for many reasons, for positive and negative reasons. I think there was definitely a trend that I'd noticed in the previous maybe 18 months or so, where sustainability had really ramped up in people's mind and importance. And I was going into COVID, I think I was fearing it was going to be a bit like the financial crisis, where there'd been a similar ramping up and then it just vanished as a subject. But that hasn't happened at all. I think quite the opposite has been our experience. I may be interested if Basil has noticed the same, but there has definitely not been a let up. And if anything, I think there's been an acceleration of people's desire for a better environment, both in their sort of immediate health and well-being sense, and in the more global climate change sense. So I sense that climate change, science-based targets, all of these kinds of mechanisms are definitely increasing quite rapidly. And as you say, collaborations between organizations become more and more important in that, and the sharing of knowledge, I think, becomes more and more important within that.
Mm-hmm. Basil, I see you nodding a fair bit there.
Yeah, no, I violently agree with Peter as always. I think that's absolutely true, and I think perhaps stating the obvious. I think during the lockdown we've had plenty of time, as people, as humans, to sit in our own thoughts and contemplate what we want to do with our lives, what's important to us, and the rest. These kind of sort of big existential questions we've been asking ourselves, and that's happened to every person in every organization, and we see, I think, as a result of that, people taking the kind of climate issue a lot more seriously, because they feel like they want to make a positive difference, as opposed to sitting on their heels and resting. And no doubt, I think people respond to crises in different ways. There are people that crumble, and it's sad, and we need to help and support them. But then there are other people who rise to the occasion and say, right, I'm rolling up my sleeves. This is it. This is my moment. My time is now. And I think our job in many ways is to seek out those people, and to water and nurture those relationships, and make sure that we're leaning into them. And that's certainly, as a firm, what we've done. On the supply chain, I think it has been a year of crisis management for suppliers. Getting materials to site. We've been carrying on in our projects like CADWorks in Glasgow, which was subject to lockdown for 3 months there, but working with the amazing builders at B&K. They've come back with a vengeance and have made up time, and you spare a thought for them. That's all the issues that we're facing are happening all the way up and down their supply chain. And so, the dedication and commitment of people like that, I think, has been amazing. And I think they take with it the same enthusiasm as they're looking at these kind of climate issues. And so I'd say it's a can-do attitude has emerged from the crisis.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And when we were working back in sort of March, April, there was the big existential question of what's going on with supply chains. How do we help people distance? How do we help our employees? But now I think a lot of attention has turned to the longer term financial piece. And obviously you have specific experience in finance and asset management. So do you have any concerns about investment ability, and how can businesses work along with financiers and also the government, which seems to be announcing new funding packages every week, it feels like, to overcome that and avoid sort of looking for a race to the bottom just to keep themselves going?
Yeah, look, I think since our inception almost a decade ago, our point has been that the future of real estate is around sustainability, around environmental outcomes and social outcomes, in a blended approach to those two things, taking them both into consideration holistically. We look at the world, and what we see is a huge untapped market. 99% of basically not very sustainable. A mandate to insist upon it being sustainable in the next 30 years. We have in the life cycle of a building, as you well know, it's basically one refurbishment cycle. You refurbish every 30 years. So the next time you touch a building, the next time you refurbish it, needs to be net zero. Mm-hmm. Not in 30 years time, but like right now. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, it will be unsaleable. Either because the market dictates that that's not what tenants and ultimately end investors want. And if you don't believe any of that, well, then rest assured the government's going to regulate you into that position. So whether you like it or not, unsustainable building is not going to be a very good investment to make. So I think investors are waking up to that. And certainly when we talk to CEOs of our tenants and clients, what we hear from them is that they also have a crisis, which is, their staff and their stakeholders asking them about what are they doing to get to net zero, and what's their social purpose, and they're like in like serious crisis mode, because they're like, I run a complicated organization, I have no idea how to get to net zero, and purpose, what's that? That's like a 2020 word or something. Like I don't even know where to even begin with that. So our message to them as an investment fund, as an investment vehicle, and an owner of ultimately of real estate, is to say, look, come into our building, don't worry, calm down. When we give you the keys, you put the key in the door, you reduce your carbon footprint by 50% day one. And if you need a social purpose, by the way, we've got that covered too, because we're doing all these wonderful social things in our buildings that you could just plug and play. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the future. And as an investor investing in large untapped markets that will ultimately be regulated with almost unlimited unmet demand, I mean, you describe any investment case with those characteristics, and I think you would put a significant amount of capital behind that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that kind of pressure described as a sandwich of pressure. So you've got the top up and the top down, and the bottom up happening at the same time.
I mean, I think.
Sorry, you go ahead, Peter.
I was just saying, I think Basil raises a really pertinent point, and we're really noticing that as well, that increasingly organisations are under pressure. I understand that at the moment there's something like 12 million square feet of office space in central London that is occupied by companies that have science-based net zero carbon targets by 2030 that is subject to a lease event before then. So those are organisations that will be looking for net zero carbon space, and that is increasing dramatically. And I think that real estate has moved, or is in the process of moving, from supplying space, square footage, square meterage, to almost being a helping hand. As Basil said, you can reduce your carbon footprint significantly by moving into a net zero carbon building. For most service-like organisations, their buildings are maybe 50% of their carbon footprint, 40 to 50%. So simply by moving to the right building, that can be a huge driver into their ambitions around net zero carbon. And I think people are just beginning to wake up to that. And I think as well, also, the property industry is probably just beginning to wake up to that, the significance of its ability to help other parties. So I think that's quite an exciting future for it in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I presume as well that you're both seeing a lot more businesses looking at rethinking their office space or retail space this year for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole question of what's the purpose of the office, I think, has been discussed to death. But certainly, it has to reflect your values and vision as a firm, and I think we have to as an industry start advocating for the office and make the case for the office, and saying what happens there, what is the magic that happens inside any space, but in this case office, that can't happen anywhere else, and why is that a better alternative than staying at home?
Great, and you've mentioned a lot of things that are moving within the market in terms of employees, suppliers, tenants, but I think we should touch quite heavily really on policy and regulations as well. As you mentioned, Basil, there is a lot coming down the line, but we are still waiting for things like the heat and building strategy. It looks increasingly unlikely that we're going to get it before the new year. But at the same time, we've had some big announcements recently in terms of the National Investment Bank and the National Infrastructure Strategy. So in a nutshell, what has been your take on what's been going on in the policy space this year?
Yeah. Thankfully, I'm not a politician, but we all are subject to policy, I suppose. But I mean, I think things like the National Investment Bank, I mean, interesting. I mean, I always get nervous when government starts to get in the same business as the private sector. I think personal perspective, I think government's role is to foster creativity and innovation in the private sector, but not to actually be in the private sector. And I think these grand initiatives like the National Investment Bank have a long history of being failures, and maybe this one will be the example that breaks the rule. But I'm much more in favor of sharp, targeted policy that gets at changing behavior. It was in the press recently that perhaps the UK government's going to mandate that all new homes get built only with electric boilers and banning gas boilers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of controversy around that, but I think policies like that can be, if targeted well, can actually be much more effective than creating huge infrastructures, which ultimately are just totems to the people that created them, and I think have probably less impact than in the long run than they were intended.
Mm-hmm. The thing about the boilers or any standard as well is that it leaves sort of no room, no wiggle room, no hiding room. Well, we was in a discussion about the net zero target with businesses earlier this week, and they said, well, it's actually been much more useful than the 80% target, because we all like to think that we could have been part of the 20%.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Sorry,
and you know, same thing. It's the same thing with electric cars. Like, you know, big bold ambition, but let's make it clear. Like, as of X date, pick a date, doesn't matter which one. Petrol diesel cars no longer on offer. So, like it or leave it. You know, that's the policy. Get on with it. I think those kind of things probably are much more direct levers to innovation than creating you know, bureaucracy.
Peter, can I bring you in on this topic as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Basil said, really. I have to say, from my own personal perspective, regulation for a long time hasn't been the key driver, actually. I think that depends on the market. And I think in the residential market, particularly a more regional market, regulation is probably the driver. But for us, I can't think of the last project that I worked on where the building regulations were the driver for the environmental standards. It's things beyond that. You're way beyond that. And I think that the better end of the property sector is running way ahead of the public sector and the government at the moment on its response to climate change. And I think in that sense, Basil's absolutely right that if the government just sets the target and lets people get on and deal with it. If I have some wishes around that, I wish that there would be well, one thing I wish that VAT would be removed off refurbishment. That just seems insane to me that you spend 20% VAT on insulation but 5% on coal is nuts. And I wish there was something mandatory, whether that's a price or something of that ilk, around the carbon that is in effect mitigated by using the existing building stock, because we now know that actually with most modern buildings the carbon emitted as a result of constructing it vastly outweighs its operational carbon emissions over its lifetime, and so retention and embodied carbon would help significantly in driving the industry in the right direction.
No, I think that's spot on, and you know, there's this other great statistic that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built. So we could create these wonderful new builds on green and brownfield sites, but ultimately the battle's going to be won and lost in the stuff that we're already sitting in.
On the VAT point, I wanted to check. I remember reporting, I think last year, on solar VAT being quite quite contentious issue, and a lot of people asking for cuts on solar VAT and batteries. But I've been a bit out of the loop on that this year. Do you guys know what's going on in that space at all?
If I'm absolutely honest, no, I don't really.
But I think what's interesting is on solar in particular, I think we've obviously taken, in a similar way, taken out the feed-in tariffs. Those have gone away. And I think ultimately these things, they need to stand on their own 2 feet. And again, I think what Peter said is absolutely right, that we need to do these things because they're market-driven solutions. And ultimately the market is, believe it or not, a more powerful force than government often. And if we can leverage and harness the power of the private sector to create these solutions and scale them, then fantastic. So I do think we ultimately need a little bit of a kickstart with government help, like with the feed-in tariffs and solar, but a pathway to wean us off that, and at a point where these things just become self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the best things that could be done in that market, rather than worrying about the taxation levels on renewable energies, is simply to remove the hidden subsidies on the fossil fuel industry, which are absolutely vast. And if you just get rid of those, then I mean they're already at least price parity, and probably better in the UK now. Wind, solar are much better than fossil fuel generation sources.
And I think also just to maybe to add a little bit is to we need more private sector case studies of where this is being a win. I mean, we've in our portfolio we've believe it or not let at our Windmill Green building in Manchester, we've let 50% of the space since the end of March. That's 43,000 square feet to 3 different tenants. Now that's during lockdown, during a national pandemic, at a period of time when everyone and anyone is saying that the office is dead. So why is that? Well, I think that building in particular is BREEAM Outstanding, first one in Manchester, multi-let building to be BREEAM Outstanding. It's been an award-winning building. It's a building that people like, they identify with. It's low cost to operate, has a huge amount of sustainability built in. So if they're going anywhere, they're going into that building. So the more case studies like that we can have as an industry, I think the better.
Basil, would you say there's a lack of case studies just because the buildings aren't completed yet, or are people not shouting about it enough?
I think the data is genuinely hard to get, and I think we as protagonists in the industry, I think, don't do ourselves any favors. We love to talk in terms of kilowatt hours per meter squared when we're talking about carbon, and it's like, I thought carbon is a thing you weigh, and yet we're talking about it in kilowatt hours, which no one really understands anyways. We need like a plastic straw moment. We need like something that is just so simple and easy to understand. And we say, like, why are we doing it this way when this other way is so blatantly, obviously better? And we need just to make that accessible, because again, as industry protagonists, maybe we all can understand and relate and have a debate over these sorts of things at a very technical level. But the vast majority of the Great British public really don't know and probably don't care.
Peter, I saw you nodding a bit there. Did you have something to add on that?
Again, completely agree. And I think what we've not been terribly good at as an industry is communicating the impact that the built environment has and the comparative ease that you can make a very, very big difference within that. So simply moving to the right building can, as said previously, cut a company's carbon emissions, a service-based company, by 40 or 50% almost overnight. And there's probably not been an understanding of amongst the general population, the significance of the built environment, but the increasingly comparative ease with which you can make quite major changes within that world. And so I think that's something we've got to get much better as an industry at communicating that. And I've also had a sense for a while that there's a slight disconnect maybe currently between the strategic leadership of organizations that have got quite ambitious targets and maybe several chains down where the procurement becomes more day to day, and there's a little bit of a disconnect between those two. But I think now that there is some top-down pressure from strategic organizational aims and a lot more of the upward pressure that Basil was talking about with their purpose-driven, less harmful organizations, I think that dual pressure on the procurement of buildings is probably helping enormously at the moment.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned the conversation and the average person, I couldn't help but have a flashback to when Trump got on stage and said, sustainable buildings have no windows. Everyone's just sitting in their basement in the dark, and then just thinking how good some of these passive house buildings in the Nordics and regions like that look. So there's definitely some misinformation going around. But yes, so we've covered so much in this conversation, but we are running out of time. But before I hang up and let you go about your days, we're asking all of our speakers that come on at this time of year to tell us a bit about their professional and sustainability related New Year's resolutions, so we can all reflect on the year that we've had and look forward to 2021. So perhaps I could start with Basil.
Sure. I think I remember being asked this question at this point last year, and I think I answered that was my personal resolution was to spend more time with my family. And I think so. Be careful what you wish for, because I've been in self-confinement with them for the vast majority of 2020. So I'm not going to ask for that again. Look, I think my personal resolution is to really try to work much harder for a just transition, so transition to a net zero economy, but in a way that's just and fair for all, because I do think it has the potential to leave a great many people behind. And so that I think is going to be a main focus of my attention in 2021.
Fantastic. And how about yourself, Peter?
I think it's probably some of the stuff we've been talking about, the way the industry isn't particularly good at communicating and the information that we kind of have, but it isn't particularly accessible. So I think if there's a professional New Year's resolution, it's probably something around dissemination and communicating with others, and I suppose as well trying to meet with people for real as well, hopefully by out of this. People like Basil, who I've met a lot online, but never actually in person.
Fair point.
Something I think we'll all be looking forward to for 2021. Well, thank you both so much for coming on today and sharing your insights with me.
With pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me as well. Thank you.